Welcome to Epistemology Online, where the idea is to get people to articulate what they believe to be true and false, good and evil, and their rationale behind it. Hopefully a different way of discourse online. So in the previous video, you were saying we were talking about wealth inequality and taxation and what might be done about that. But halfway through or three-quarters of the way through, I realized that kind of a foundation to that is the place of government, and we kind of talked about like what is your definition of government, and I kind of wanted to pick up there if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. Then I'll kick off the timer and prepare for the questioning, and then we'll see where it goes. Okay, it is clicking down. Ooh, 15 minutes on the clock. Begin now. So what would be like the dictionary definition of a government that you would agree with?
I think it can look in a lot of different ways. But if I had to simplify it, it would be a body or person who rules over a certain portion of land or a certain society. And obviously that can look very different. But if I had to simplify it to just a definition without actually looking at the dictionary definition, I think that'd be what I'd come down to.
So somebody who rules a piece of land. So am I the government for like maybe my house?
I mean, if you want to look at it that way, I could also be the queen of my office here, but I mean, that's just an arbitrary title, but I guess you could call it true.
What makes it unarbitrary then for, like, say, the government of Texas?
I think in order to have rule, you have to have the authority behind that. So as far as the authority of Texas, we've had history and tradition, and they have a governor now where everyone kind of buys into it, elects the governor, and kind of all agree that he is the authority. Now that's happened over hundreds of years now. I mean, Texas used to be its own country. So to downgrade to a state, in a sense, had to happen over time. But I think it kind of is everyone who is under that person's rule kind of has to, if not agree with that person, at least agree with their leadership, like that they are in charge. In the sense of you can't be a leader if no one believes that you're the leader. It's kind of this shared mindset, I guess. Yeah. So
government's all in your head? Like
I mean, if you
predicated upon one's belief?
In a sense, if you want to view it that way, if you just want to view that there are no nations, no borders, we're all just humans and everything is arbitrary, I don't think that's necessarily true, but it could be a viewpoint that a person could have, that we're all just humans making these borders on lands that never needed them. And basically we're all the same, one human race. But that's very bad, like very big worldview that I don't necessarily agree with. But but also I think what the government needs is a way to enforce their rule. So in a society that can look like the military, it can look like a national guard or something. Because somehow they had to get to that power. It could also be an elective process. We elect them to be the leader, and then they enforce that with power, whatever that power looks like.
It seems like the power that you were mentioning was like military might, basically, like physical power. Would you agree with that? Like that's kind of one of the defining characteristics of a government, physical power over other people?
I think in a sense, yes. At least when it's starting out. If you look over at like different dictatorships, I would say they definitely rule by military might. Like right. If you don't agree with them, you can get imprisoned. Obviously, in America, we have different freedoms and different rights. And we've been around for a while. So I wouldn't say that it's the military that scares us into believing that the president has power. But in that sense, we elect a president and then assign them the ability to have power. But as far as other countries go, he can enforce his power with the military.
So what would you think you were saying that if somebody disagrees with like a dictatorship, they could be, a force may be enacted upon them to get them to play along. How, I guess I don't understand how that's different in the U.S. I think only maybe the mechanism by which people are put into power is different. But fundamentally, like if you disagree with, I don't know, what type of vegetation you can have in your pocket, there's certain states where physical force may be used upon you, right?
Yeah. So I think rule of law is different than just recognizing someone's power. So I can sit here, I have freedom of speech. I can say that I think Trump is a terrible president. Does that mean I'm going to get put in prison? No, because my freedom of speech protects that. And what I'm saying is not against the law. Whereas if I, like you said, like if I have some certain substances in my house, I also live in a state where that's not legal, then I'm disobeying the law. And then the president or the person in power has the authority to back up that law with force. So it's not necessarily that they can just put whoever they want to in prison, but we have these laws that have been enacted that we have to follow. And if we don't follow, then that's when the force kind of comes into play.
Right. So it's not, if I'm hearing you rightly, it's not arbitrary because there's a law that is written down. Is that what makes it not arbitrary?
I think not that it's just written down, but we've had these elected officials who go to Congress, who write the laws, who enact the laws, and then the president signs off on the laws. And if anyone has a problem with the laws, it can go before the judicial branch, and they can decide whether it's an actual law or not. So we have these different systems of government that kind of reinforce what a law actually is. And then lower down the line, you have the different like police forces or army or whatever you want to look at that actually go out and enforce said law, whatever it is. So it's not necessarily that it's just written down, but we have these systems of power and systems of government that back up the authority of the law.
Yeah, so like if I was to add up the total number of the Senate, well, I guess that's 100, right? And the total number members of Congress, which is 600 some odd. Oh, 437?
Yeah.
Thank you for telling me that. So 437 plus 100 plus, I guess the president, I guess you could call the cabinet, like the advisors, they may, have some sway in that. Supreme Court. So there's about 600 people or so like weighing in kind of on it. And because it goes through that many people, that's what makes it not arbitrary. Well,
and that would just be about federal law, not even talking about state law. That would be a whole other issue.
Totally different ball game, but just on the federal side, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the fact that in at least our society, we elect our officials. So these officials aren't just popped out of nowhere. They're not randomly assigned. So they come with the power of the people they represent. So in Texas, you have 2 senators who represent all the population of Texas. And then I don't know how many representatives Texas had at this point, but they each have their districts. Yeah. And they each have their districts to represent the people in those districts. So it's not just that Ted Cruz from Texas just does whatever he wants on his own power. Theoretically, if he's doing his job right, he should be representing the full power of the population of Texas. And so that's kind of where their power comes from. And if they're doing their job right, they should be representing all of their constituents in whatever laws that they enact.
What if it's a opposing viewpoint? So like Ted Cruz has somebody who, Beto O'Rourke, for example, and let's say they just disagree on one thing. I know there's many things they disagree on, but one says Hot Pockets are totally fine, you can have them. The other one says Hot Pockets are not fine, you can't have them. And it's like a 51-49 vote. So what would be like the right law to pass in that silly? I know it's a super silly example, but I'm trying to get it out of all like there's a lot of muck out there right now. So just to put it in like the platonic form of the perfect law, what would Amanda advocate for, I guess, in that particular situation? Because he can't necessarily represent 100% of everybody, only 51% if he won, by a 51-49 split. Right.
So that's kind of what, like, democracy is messy. You're never going to have 100% support on basically anything. So I think that's where it's important that people are popularly elected. So that means at that point in time when that person was elected, the majority of people supported that person. And then as far as specific laws, it's kind of up to that senator to decide, is this for the best? Is this best for the people that I represent? So it could be a thing where only 51% of people voted for him, but that doesn't mean he just represents the 51%. He also represents the other 49. And I think if I wanted to get on a whole other track, I think that's a thing that a lot of politicians ignore, that they represent their whole body of constituents. So I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer, but a good politician would listen to all of his constituents, hear both sides, and then make the best decision that that person can. And that's all you can really hope for, is that they just make a good, informed decision that's for the best of the most amount of people that it can be.
I was just thinking about, like, if I wanted to take some friends out to dinner or something, like, how would I decide that? Like, it's a real tricky proposition to get a bunch of people to agree on something as trivial as, like, Red Lobster or Olive Garden, much less, like... So in quarter four, should we use quantitative easing to try to back the petrodollar? That's so we don't have any economic fallout. I find that to be an interesting calculation for people to make. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm trying as hard as I can to try to stay as neutral as possible, just to try to understand what you think. I think that's something that is not done enough, and I'm realizing how very difficult it is. So what would be on the topic of government, what would be the perfect government to Amanda? Let's assume you could wave a magic wand and anything happens. What does that look like?
I mean, if I'm honest, there is no perfect government because people aren't perfect. And I know that's like not really the answer that you're looking for, but at the end of the day, there is going to be no perfect government because people aren't perfect. But if I was going to set up a form of government, it really depends on the people that you're governing. I think a good example that I like to look into is like the Scandinavian countries. Like Norway, Finland, Sweden. That's where my husband's family is from. I got to go there. I got to go to Norway on my honeymoon. It's great. It's pretty. I recommend it. But it's also interesting case study because they also have a very different form of government than other nations. And they also rank number one, or at least in the top 10, consistently in happiness of the people that live there. Their amount of wealth is better than other countries. They have less crime, less violence. And it's all a wonder of like, well, how does that happen? And part of it, yes, is that their form of government, it's to simplify it or really oversimplify it, it's more of a democratic socialist type environment. They're not completely socialist. They're not completely fully democratic. It's kind of this mix in between. I highly recommend reading more about it because it's a lot more complicated than I can just explain. But what I read about it is it's not just a copy and paste method. The people that live in these countries also have a very high work ethic. They're largely, obviously it's not going to be everyone, but largely everyone works hard for what they do. And that obviously affects how a nation feels about one another, how it feels about its government. The people trust the government trusts the people. And that leads to a pretty profitable and successful society. So who's doing it perfectly? No one. But I think that looking at the Scandinavian countries is kind of a really cool case study to see how much the people can affect the government and the government therefore can affect the people.
Interesting. So I know we're kind of in our last minute here. Do you think that kind of your views have been accurately expressed by yourself? Like, is this a format or a method that is helpful for you to be able to advocate or talk about things that you find important?
I think so. I think it's important for us to have discussions and to be able to talk and express our ideas. But I'm also very much of a like numbers and statistics and figures person. So like I'm also sitting here and want to like fact check myself as I'm talking to you because I'm a history major. I'm studied in like historical research, and I don't ever want to say anything without like a source or like a backup. Like I want to make sure that what I'm telling you is correct. So in that case, I like to be able to do some written arguments as well, just because then I can research myself. I can research my person that I'm talking to. And I like fact-based information, which is harder to fact check yourself in the middle of a conversation, which is why I think that education beforehand is super important as well. And make sure you know what you're talking about before you say it.
Right. I've had a personal motto to try to delineate clearly what I know to be true versus what I think to be true and what evidences are used to support that versus what I've heard to be true and cannot verify myself. Because there are things that are way beyond the scope of this little peanut brain that can handle, right? So anyway, that is the end of the 15 minutes. I hope you had some fun. And is there anything you want to add before I end this particular recording?
I don't think so. It's been a lot of fun. I think more people should be able to talk like this. So,
cool. Well, till next time, everybody. Goodbye. My hope is that people can start listening to what other people are saying and try to understand like how they're thinking. That's kind of my goal.